honor to be here. I started my shop January 1970, so we just had our 45th anniversary, but I've been collecting instruments since early 1963. And I was interested in the music before that, but I actually didn't start to play till then. I've collected snakes longer than I've collected guitars. Got my first snake when I was 8. Undergraduate work, University of Chicago, Animal Behavior Studies, did graduate work in zoology at Duke. I still have 18 snakes in my office, but the guitars are the hobby that got out of hand. And I feel very fortunate to have a business that is effectively a hobby that got out of hand. It's the kind of thing that I would never want to retire from any more than probably you folks would want to retire from enjoying or playing music. If you're doing something that you really like, and it grows to the point where you can actually support yourself doing it, it's quite a blessing. And I actually have a passion for guitars, banjos, and mandolins, and other good quality instruments. The really good ones have soul and personality. I don't view them as inanimate objects, because when you pick them up, the really, really great ones really are responsive and they feel alive. It's one of the things that, for me, separates the average from the really great. The average ones may be compliant tools that do as they're told, but they're not so much your partner that suggests something you might not have thought of on your own. But great instruments actually bring something out and inspire a musician to do things that they may lead him into some places he wouldn't have thought of on his own. You still have to have talent as a musician, but the great instruments really change a person. And for example, if you listen to Bill Monroe recordings, the Monroe Brothers recordings, they don't sound anything like he sounded after he got his F5 mandolin. His whole approach to playing and to music changed when he got that mandolin. It would do things that no mandolin other than an F5 that was available at that time could do. And he started playing chopped chords. His rhythm changed. He could drive a 5-piece band with rhythm on a mandolin, and he could play lead solos that could really be heard. And it changed him. Great instruments really do inspire. They have soul and personality, and they may be kind of quirky. They do some things better than others, but they make great suggestions. For the non-player, the best analogy would be car. You can get a ride in the back seat of a sedan, and frankly, it's hard to feel the difference between a Rolls-Royce, a Cadillac, or any other. If you're sitting in the back seat, the Chevrolet will do pretty darn well. If you're sitting in the passenger seat up front, you get a little bit more feel of what the car is like. But it's only after you get behind the wheel and you drive it yourself you really feel the true responsiveness of a car. And the really great cars do indeed make suggestions. The problem with the suggestions for the cars, like in 1974, I got a BMW 3.0S, and every damn suggestion it made produced blue lights behind me. Guitars and banjos and mandolins, all the suggestions they make, some may sound better than the others, but if you're a professional musician, you might actually make money off of these great suggestions, and even if you're just an amateur, you'll have more fun. Guitars and other fretted instruments are really fun, and the good ones feel alive. Now, I'm known for dealing vintage instruments, but my shop really has 3 categories of instruments. We have vintage, used, and new. There are 3 very different categories. And I deal with 3 basic types of customers. Utility tool users, who happen to be great musicians sometimes, but they're not interested in collecting. They don't care so much about what year it is and what model it is, and whether it's been modified or not. Bill Monroe was a utility tool user. You can look at pictures of him when he first got his F5. It looked new. You can look at how it looked by the early 50s, and he obviously wasn't a collector. He beat the shit out. It was not treated well. You can look at Earl Scruggs and the history of his banjo. That thing was beautiful, original condition, 5-string flathead Granada when he got it. And by the time he was done, it was probably on about its 6th neck, and the resonator had been refinished, and the tension hoop and the flange had been replaced. And it had the original rim, and it had the original tone ring. There wasn't much else original about it. It sounded great. He did wonderful things so far as playability. So far as what he did to it as collectability was the next generation wouldn't have any if everybody treated their instruments the way Bill treated his mandolin or Earl treated his banjo. But I deal with musicians who are what I call utility tool users, collectors. Collectors ask completely different questions. The musician, the utility tool user, wants to know how does it feel, how does it sound. They might care how it looks, they might care how it looks to match their outfit, but I'm not claiming they're not legitimate players. Some of the finest musicians the world has ever known were utility tool users so far as their instruments. And for that matter, some of the finest music in the world that's ever been composed was composed on instruments that were utility tools rather than great collectibles. You don't have to always have a great collectible to be a good musician. I make more profit on great collectibles. But collectors ask completely different questions. They want to know who made it. They want to know what model it is. They want to know what year it is. They're interested in the history of that model, the evolution of the model, the reputation of the maker and the history of the maker. They want to know if that instrument is not only cosmetically and structurally good, they want to know if it's been modified in any way, and if so, what was done. If it's been refinished, they might not want it. If it's been refretted, or if it's an old guitar that the neck was reset, if it was professionally done, they'd rather it be all original, but they recognize that a good reset and a good refret can enhance value over what it was before that work was done. And people often ask me, how much does it devalue a guitar if it's been refretted? Well, a pristine, fully original instrument that needs no work whatever is worth more than a restored instrument. But if you've had your guitar tuned to full tension for 70 years and have 200 pounds of string tension on it, it's like putting braces on a kid's teeth, because it doesn't take 70 years to move the kid's teeth. These things move, and it's not that the necks come loose, but the body deforms on the guitar a bit. And the end result is the action is high. And that's not original specs. Or if the frets are worn so that it's unplayable, that's not original specs either. So would I rather have a guitar that's virtually unplayable because the frets are worn out and the neck set angle is bad, or would I rather have that instrument restored? The answer is I'd rather have it restored. If all that repair could do would be to reduce value, I could free up 6,000 square feet in my building and fire 10 people because I wouldn't need them anymore. My repair staff is there to service what we sell. It's not so much there for general public repair, although we do take in public repair. The point is, one of the things that sets my business apart from many others is that we are equipped to do major surgery. And a lot of vintage instruments, in order to be really playable and to perform the way they were originally intended, need work. And these things are beautiful pieces of art, but they're also, if properly set up, wonderful sounding, great instruments. And for them to have their proper voice, they need to be set up in good playing order. If they've been tuned at full tension for 70 years or more, and had changes of humidity along the way where they might not have been humidified properly. One of the things that is a problem is central heat brings in the air from the outside and warms it up to room temperature. And when it's 7 degrees outside, you know how much water is in that air? Virtually none. And relative humidity, when you bring that in and heat it up to 70, that air is drier, as far as relative humidity, in the middle of the Sahara Desert. And things move. We have Nortec humidification systems in our shop. And it's amazing how much water it takes to keep things right. So I do urge people to have proper humidification concerns for their own instruments if they want to stay in good condition. But collectors ask totally different questions. When I have them, they come in my shop and talk to them in 2 minutes. You know if they're a collector or a utility tool user. The third category, speculators. Speculators, you can talk to them the first 2 minutes, you know. They talk about instruments as though they're looking at a spreadsheet. They'll tell you about the price fluctuations over the years and how much money they've made selling instruments. They come in, they tell you, I'm a collector. Well, what do you have? And you have a very focused thing, a few things that are currently either for sale or that will be soon. You know, they buy it because the price is here and it's been doing this. They think the graph is going to go that way. This looks good. If it's been doing that and they think it's going to do that, they're not interested. If it's been doing this and they think it's going to do that, they sure enough don't want it. Either way, the appraised value is the same. But this looks good. This is okay if you're a utility tool user. If you're buying a car and it's going to keep its value and you can use it that way, that'd be good. You'd be delighted to have a car that didn't go down. You wouldn't expect it to go up. The only cars that go up are things like you get the right Goldwing Mercedes, and if you park it and don't drive it, it'll go up. If you commute to work with it every day, it doesn't go up. But guitars, you can play them. And if you treat them well, they can look good 100 years later. They outlast us. But speculators don't care about that. They care about what they can get for it in the near future. If it's been doing this, they think it's going to do that, they're willing to buy at retail. They're even willing to drive the price up a bit over current retail if they're really confident it's going up. And in 50 years of collecting, I've seen periods when prices went up rapidly. I've seen periods when prices plateaued, and I've seen some things fall. And people ask sometimes, how much is my guitar going to be worth in 10 years? And well, if your broker could tell you how much Amazon.com stock or eBay stock would be worth in 10 years, it probably wouldn't even need to be a broker. He'd already be a billionaire. But I can't answer somebody when they ask how much their guitar is going to be worth in 10 or 20 years. I can tell you the prices have changed by changing demographics, economics, technology. The evolution of instruments changes depending on all of these things as well. They didn't invent electric guitars before the invention of radio or talking movies, but very quickly following that were electric guitars. And how much these instruments will be worth later on depends on musical and social trends, economic and demographic trends. But the best customers I ever had were baby boomers. And I'm 69 years old, and I've been to a lot of funerals lately. And half those people were younger than me, too. In order for instruments to be valuable 20 years from now, they have to have the ability to cross generational boundaries so far as people wanting them. And I certainly predict a good pre-World War II Martins and Gibsons, Larson Brothers instruments are still going to be valuable 20 years from now. But they don't necessarily have to automatically always go up by a certain percentage every year. People say, well, they don't make vintage instruments anymore, so they have to go up. Well, they don't make land anymore either. And if you follow the real estate market, it doesn't always go up. In real estate, it's location, location, location. With instruments, it does help to have the right ones. And a lot of the instruments that are the most sought after today are the very same ones that were sought after when I first opened my shop 45 years ago. People wanted good, old Martin Dreadnought-sized guitars. And they wanted smaller Martins, too, for old-timey. But the bluegrassers always wanted Dreadnoughts. The R&B people wanted old Les Pauls and old Telecasters and old Stratocasters. They still do. The bluegrass banjo players really, really wanted a one-piece flange flathead master tone, and they'd pay extra if it was original 5-string. They still do. Prices are more now than they were then. The Lloyd Loar F5 mandolin in 1969, top buck, was about $1,500. And now they bring over $150,000. Except in the early part of '07, they were bringing over $200. I don't know anybody paying over $200 for them now. There was a market bubble. Prices on many items escalated very rapidly from mid-'02 through late '06. There was a market bubble in real estate and in guitars and then a fair number of other things. And then by '08, it was sure enough obvious that there was a big downturn. And with that downturn, a lot of the speculators dropped out of the market. Now, I find that there's a lot of utility tool users, maybe good musicians, who bellyache that collectors have bid up the price high enough that I can't afford one anymore. I can't have a pre-war D45. They only made 91 of those. If they were free, they'd only have been 91. And the worst beat-up D45s I've seen that were trashed were owned by professional musicians. And that means that of the 91, only about half of them are still left in good condition. But market conditions can change with time. Speculators dropped out of the market when they saw that the prices were doing this or doing this. They're gone. They haven't come back. When collectors bellyache that they can't afford it because the speculators have outbid them, that is a problem. Because it's sort of like the Roadrunner cartoons. Like suppose this is a cliff and here's a 3,000-foot drop. Well, the utility tool users get about this far, and then the collectors are still willing to pay a bit more, and they're bellyaching after this point. They don't want to buy it anymore. And the collectors will go about this far. They actually look down. And they notice that, gee, this mandolin now costs as much as I paid for my house, and it costs as much as my annual income, and I can't afford to collect 3 dozen of these. And beyond this point, I'm dropping out. But the speculators, they see this, they think that, they continue to buy. When they do that, they can skate on thin air, because they're Wile E. Coyote, and the Phantom Prophet Roadrunner is out here. But the Phantom Prophet Roadrunner, within 1.5 to 2 years, will turn around and go beep, because after this point, it will last no more than 2 years before there will be a market correction. That's true of real estate, it's true of guitars, banjos, mandolins, almost any commodity that's collectible or usable that you may think of. And a dealer like me can talk to a customer, and in 2 to 3 minutes, I know which category of person they are. And if I see that beyond point X, the only people who buy are folks who are speculators, it scares me. From that point on, all I want to do is consign those things, because I'm afraid to buy them outright at the new price, because you can lose your ass at it. But it doesn't affect the quality of the instrument. The Lloyd Loar F5, when it was $1,500, was every bit as good a mandolin as it was when it was $250,000. And if it's only 150 or 125 now, the quality of the mandolin didn't go down. But market conditions change. If we're going to talk about quality, What makes an instrument great? It's not great because it's old. You know, there are still people who are skilled makers. What sets aside old ones from new ones, but what really makes an instrument great? Number one is design. And I don't mean how pretty it is. The design, for example, let's use the example of an airplane. If you have a well-designed airplane with good workmanship and good materials, you might feel secure to go fly from here to Los Angeles and be 40,000 feet up. If you have a plane with fantastic workmanship and gorgeous materials and gold-plated fixtures and everything else, but the design is bad, you're going to fall down, you'll die. Same with cars. If you're driving on the interstate, you want a car that's well designed. Design is number one. Without good design, it will not perform well, no matter how good the materials or the workmanship are. If you have a great design, and you have such bad workmanship that it's going to fall apart, you'll also die. At least with the instruments, if it fails, you don't die. But with the cars and airplanes, you do. But the basic fundamental is the same. Design is number one. What makes a Stradivari, Guarneri violin, what makes them so great, or the Lohr F5, or the Flathead Master Tone, it's design. The Flathead Master Tone is not an instrument with better workmanship than some of the banjos by Clifford Essex in England, but the design is sure better. The Flathead Master Tone is an amazingly good design, as is the Lohr F5, as is the Wright Martin Dreadnought, or Martin guitars in general, and Martins are not the only ones that are good. Gibson Advanced Jumbo is a great guitar. Or the Les Paul Gibson Electric, or the Telecaster. Telecaster does not have better workmanship than a Martin, but it does things a Martin won't do, and vice versa. But you need great design, number one. If you have a great design and you have fine structural workmanship, it doesn't have to be pretty structural workmanship. It can be rough looking. It still will, as long as it doesn't fail, the workmanship is solid, so it holds together, it will work. If you have mediocre materials coupled with good structural workmanship and a great design, it will outperform the finest materials and workmanship on a bad design. The difference in great materials versus mediocre materials is noticeable but not near as great as the difference between good design and bad design. And you can make a guitar with some pretty mediocre wood and some sloppy workmanship, and if it has a great design, it'll sound surprisingly good. If you couple it with great materials, that helps. And great materials like Adirondack spruce versus Sitka spruce. Adirondack spruce is what Martin and Gibson used prior to World War II, and it's one of the things that really is responsible in part for the pre-war sound. It is subtly different, it has greater clarity to the tone, it really does inspire me and quite a few other players. It does produce a better instrument. You couple great design with great workmanship, great materials, and then make it pretty, that sells. You can have something that's ugly and sounds good, and it's going to be hard to market it. If you have something that really just has, there's something to have designs, the lines flow. It looks good. There's other things that just look awkward. It's just like, people, most people look pretty good. Most animals look pretty good. But if you have one that's got a deformity, and I mean a physical, it's born with a congenital defect, it doesn't look good. And you can look at most animals, and even if you've never seen that species, you can look at it, and you can tell if it's healthy or not, or if it has a congenital deformity. And usually those deformities don't look pretty. But great instruments do combine design, structural workmanship, great materials, and then great cosmetics do help sell them. And there are some areas in which great cosmetics don't mean a bleep. For example, military weapons. Those people don't care how pretty it is. If you have two armies and one has lovingly handcrafted rifles, each one took a year of hand workmanship and beautiful carving and inlaying and engraving, and the other side has guns with mediocre materials, but it's not going to fall apart this year. It's not built to last more than 5 years, and the stock is plastic, and the side with the AK-47s will beat the side with the flintlock, and or the great swordsmanship. It's just like seeing Raiders of the Lost Ark and bang. Workmanship is important, but design counts. And with musical instruments, it is really important that you have something with a great design to produce the sound that you want. And other interesting thing though, design, we think of Martin dreadnoughts and Gibson mandolins and Gibson banjos as having been designed for bluegrass. They weren't. We think of Telecasters and Les Pauls as having been designed for rhythm and blues and rock. They weren't. They're versatile enough that they can be used for a variety of different types of music. But the Lohr mandolin, Lloyd Lohr played classical. They were interested in what was going to be used in mandolin orchestras. They had things like they were played along with stuff like this. You don't use these in bluegrass or old-timey much, although they really do sound good. They're neat. This is a mandocello tuned like a cello. Mandolins are tuned like a violin. Mandolas are tuned like a viola. Mandocellos are tuned like a cello. Gibson also made mando basses. And from turn of the century on into the early 1920s, the biggest demand for mandolins, and those who were designing mandolins, were designing them for classical music, that you could use the same sheet music as for an orchestra or a string quartet or ensemble. And Lohr was a classical player. The F5 mandolin was introduced in mid-1922 when the mandolin orchestra boom was dying. And Gibson wondered, what can we do to kickstart mandolin sales? We're going to make a better mandolin. They might as well have introduced the best buggy whip in the world after the invention of the automobile. Nobody cared how good a mandolin was. They didn't want one. Dixieland music was on the scene. They wanted tenor banjos. They didn't want mandolins. The Lloyd Lohr mandolin was a commercial flop. That's why it's so rare. It's a great mandolin, but it took Bill Monroe in the early 40s to discover what you could do with it. And even there, he got his in the early 40s. It wasn't until 1945 that he played what we call real bluegrass. And he got Earl Scruggs. But if it hadn't been Earl, he would have probably gotten Don Reno, but Don Reno got drafted. When he came back from the Army, he saw what Earl was doing, and he made sure he played something different. How many people do you know who really became famous being a clone of somebody else? It's, nobody who plays Bill Monroe's style mandolin got to be more famous than Bill doing it. Jesse McReynolds has his own style. Or Bela Fleck doesn't try to sound like Earl. He knows how to play like Earl. Sonny Osborne didn't try to sound exactly like Earl. It's important to have your own signature sound. It's great to play tunes that somebody else does. If you want to be a well-known, really successful musician, you probably want to have a sound of your own, unless you're a session player in which you're supposed to be a chameleon and can do anything. But most of the great instruments today that are really, really sought after are not being used for the music they were designed for. Like if you listen to a Les Paul recording, it doesn't sound like Michael Bloomfield. It doesn't sound like Eric Clapton. And you're hard-pressed to find anybody who plays Les Paul's style music on a Les Paul guitar. When Bloomfield started using one, everybody all of a sudden wanted one, but Gibson had discontinued making them in 1960 for the Les Paul Standard single cut. That's the last of the Sunburst Les Pauls that people really, really wanted. And I remember when I was starting to deal guitars, I'd go out and I'd be looking for old Martins and old Gibsons and F5s and the right banjos. I like Vega old-timey banjos and Gibson master tones. I'd go around looking, and it was easier to find some of that stuff in Chicago, where I was going to the University of Chicago with pawn shops and walking distance and the fret shop that dealt used instruments. And back then, these things weren't so old either. In 1963, 1940 guitar really wasn't all that old. Even when I opened up my shop, January 1970, a 30-year-old guitar was 1940. That could be a pre-war D45 or a herringbone D28. Today, a 30-year-old guitar, that's not so old. That's 1985. And we don't think of 1985 as a vintage instrument. But when I opened up my shop, a 30-year-old guitar was a pre-war vintage instrument. Or a 20-year-old electric, that could be a Fender Broadcaster. Or the oldest Stratocaster in the world was 16 years old when I opened up my store. I'm old. But the market has changed. But people still want the same instruments. The instruments can be used for different types of music. And the great instruments are versatile enough. They stand the test of time. There's nothing obsolete about a 1922 F5. It has all the bells and whistles of the new one. There's absolutely nothing obsolete about 1930 Mastertone flathead banjo. The only thing the new one has that they didn't have in 1930 is the new one has a geared fifth string tag. There's nothing else that's changed. And a herringbone D28 made in mid-1934 is not the least bit obsolete. And the same is true even of electric guitars. That 1959 Les Paul has all the bells and whistles of the new one. And the 54 Stratocaster, the only thing that it doesn't have that the later ones had starting in 74 is that the original Strat had a 3-position pickup selector switch, and the later ones have a 5-position switch, but you can get those other two sounds on a 3-position switch if you just wiggle it. So I think at least I've given some kind of an overview. I'll throw it open for questions. I love questions. And
I'm going to do questions, but would you you were playing a little bit of that Mabel Carter style, and I know you enjoyed playing that, and so I was going to maybe someone hear one of these vintage instruments that you
It's
brought.
almost an embarrassment for me to play. My lifetime earnings playing music to date, from 63 to the present, is $43.
that is on 7 occasions that collectively add up to $43. I'm counting back in 1965, when I've been playing for 2 years. I got a call from Pete at the fret shop